I am Joseph, just for the sake of the recording. You can get most of my achievements on the Facebook page, obviously, the invite for this, but also in the last week since that went up, I'm also now a semi-finalist of Doxbridge Worlds and some achievements within that. I can't remember, in the West Division. But I speak from a position where I have sort of some understanding or experience, if not understanding, of sort of the higher level end of debating. But I will caveat all of this by saying it's just my own experience. It just reflects the things that work well for me. And particularly in whip speeches, I think people will find there's a lot of different things that will work differently for you. So take all of the advice I give with sort of a grain of salt. I'm going to try now and share a PowerPoint on the screen. Let's see if we can do this. We want to do that. That's now working. And how now do we go into presenting mode down here? This is the power of the world. Okay, whip speeches. So there's 4 little handouts as well, which are available on the Discord server. If you're watching and you aren't on that Discord server, I'll be able to share them with you. Feel free to just drop me a message and I can do that. So this is about whip speeches. And in this session, we're going to cover 1, what the goals of a whip speech are. And the hint here is it's winning the debate. Secondly, we're going to go through some specific skills that are likely to come up in a whip speech, and at a cursory level, how to improve those skills. Then we're going to talk about some different structures, some different ways to prepare, and how to work strategically. Contained within this, as I say, there are going to be 2 training exercises that you can use away from these this session to help improve your own whipping skills in the future. So let's hop straight in. I think it's important to get an understanding, thank you BBC News, I think it's important to get an understanding at the top of what we're trying to do with a whip speech. And I think fundamentally in any debate speech, we are limited by a few things. The first is time, obviously, because we have a limited amount of time we can use. We have a limited perspective we can use, because making one argument precludes you from making others. If you say, for example, we think that technocrats are really smart in your argument, you can't rely on an argument that says they're dumb, obviously speaking, but also just we have human brains, and so if we're thinking about one level of argument, we're not thinking about others. So all of debating, all speeches are about opportunity costs and trying to cram into our time and our energy as much as possible, trying to find the right strategic choices. And it's particularly true in whip speeches because it's at the end of the debate, and there's a lot of things to do. And so very much, I think you go into the whip speech with the philosophy of every little bit of time you're allocating to something, you need to be putting towards the right thing. And the goal fundamentally of this, but also of any kind of training at a whip speech, should be to give you a better understanding of what strategic choices are going to be the most valuable, so that innately, without having to think too much about it, you're going to be making those choices on a more strategic level. Early in the debate, we've got to gamble when we're making those choices, because we don't know what other people are going to say. We don't know where the debate's going to go. We don't know what's going to be effective and what isn't. By the time we get to the whip speech, really we should know, because we've seen at least 6/8 of the debate, potentially 7/8 if you're doing the op whip speech. And as a result of that, you're having a very strong understanding of what is going to be going on. Obviously, there's a caveat to that in different formats. A whip speech may have some other stuff happening after it, but certainly in terms of substantive content, you should have a really strong understanding, and you should be in the perfect place to make these strategic choices. That said, therefore, there shouldn't be one universal way to do it. And I know in some whip speech seminars that have existed in the past over the last 10 years or so, you'll see people saying, do a whip speech like this, do it by theme, compare yourself to the 3 other teams in the debate. I think that's limiting, and I think at times you're going to be making poor strategic choices if you commit yourself to always doing a whip speech in a particular way. So I think you need to be clever. I think you need to be flexible about the way you're doing these speeches. Always thinking, what's the most useful way to use my time? And what do the judges want from this speech? How can I use this speech to clarify the debate in such a way that they are 100% certain our team is taking the win, and the other teams in the debate, they have no idea, it doesn't matter, but they know that we're definitely taking the win regardless. So you give them what they want, and we'll pick up on that a little bit later. Goals, and this is really not so much goals as because the goal is winning the debate, right? and you might need to do it in lots of different ways. You can rebuild the extension given by your partner. You can rebut other teams, and this is particularly true if you're the government whip in a BP debate and you're responding to opposition member because you're the only person who can do that. You can provide, to some extent, framing, characterizations, and examples of points being made in the extension, but you shouldn't be providing substantive new argumentation. You can compare arguments and the worlds between the two cases. You can weigh, and importantly, using weighing mechanisms to explain why you're beating a top half team, using it to explain why you're beating opposition teams in their best case scenario, and then potentially any clarification of arguments or explanations that your partner gave that you feel a need to clarify. And we'll talk about when you might want to do that when we get to that skill. We shouldn't in whip speeches be giving mechanistic analysis, saying why something happens or how it works. We shouldn't be talking about why stakeholders do things, their incentives, things like that. We shouldn't be justifying principles on the first level. We shouldn't be giving any new substantive positive explanations of substantive positive material. But we may want to, if we want to, we need to disguise it as one of the things above, particularly principles. I think people are quite bad at noticing when the principle is substantively new in the whip. There may be flexibility. I would say err on the side of caution, don't do these things, trust your partner to have done a good job, and then focus on those 6 skills and how you can use them to turn whatever position you're in into a winning situation. So let's just go through those one at a time then, talk about how you can get better at each of those. The first is rebuilding the extension, and this is obviously important because insofar as the flow of the debate is operating the way we would want it to, in theory, your partner said lots of very clever things, and then the other side have attacked those clever things in a number of ways. And if you don't deal with those attacks, you're probably going to lose. Regardless of how well you deal with whatever they said, you need something, some kind of positive contribution from your partner. So don't just repeat what they said, because that's obviously not a very good use of time. The judges have already heard it already. And I think the other mistake people make a lot when they're doing rebuilding is that they will undersell what the extension was, and they will use language that makes it sound a lot less compelling than it was. So I hate the word rebuilding. I think when people are like, I'm going to rebuild my extension, that implies your extension needs to be rebuilt, that it was heavily savaged and has lots of holes in it now. I think you are in a better position if you're saying the responses we got, which we will take at their best, were insufficient to stop the extension. Linguistically, I think it just sounds so much better. And also it gets you into the mindset you should be in, which is what specific things did they say that attacked the extension? How do we deal with those ideas, rather than the idea that you are in some way trying to build the extension back up from some kind of weird ground zero. And certainly don't, if you are trying to bend the rules slightly and improve upon what your partner said in an extension, if you're trying to clarify it when rebuilding, certainly don't say what my partner meant to say is this, because it's a terrible, terrible way to make it look like your partner said nothing useful. And then I'd say general, what you should do with those 2 caveats out of the way is take a 4-step process. 1, you flag up the specific part of the extension that you're talking about, use the words your partner used, say, this is the part where my partner talked about accountability. And that should get the judges right into the right mindset. They're like, ah, yes, it's this piece of analysis I've got in my notes here. Then you want to address exactly what the responses were from the other side. Normally there'll be like 2 or 3 at like a higher level of debating. And to take the most charitable reading of it. And I think this is really important in this specific case, because if you've got some attacks that have been made on your extension, judges may read into them more than you do, but also potentially there's another speech where those attacks can be made even more robust by the other side. I think it's just much better off if you say, what's the best version this attack could possibly have been? We'll address it at that level. Then you respond to those responses. Obviously, I think this is the intuitive part. You either say, the response is wrong for this reason, or the response doesn't matter for this reason. So you sort of frame it out of the debate. For example, you say, well, this response could only have worked if these circumstances were true. If it was true that the people we're talking about make decisions for this reason, and they don't. So it's not exactly sort of refuting the point, but it's sort of moving it away and sort of making it not apply to the extension. However you do it, you want to end in a position where you have reaffirmed that original stance that you put up in an extension, and then you can run through at the end that chain of logic again, showing the judges it does stand up now. They should at this point have all 3 of the responses you heard from the other side in their heads, and they'll see that they no longer apply to what you've just put in front of them. That's a successful rebuild. It means the extension is back on track to where it should be. Probably this is the most important thing you're going to want to do in the whip speech, because you want to make very clear this is something you have that can be offered to attack other teams. It's more important than any other aspect, because even if you're rebutting the other side, if you're also rebutted to some degree, it's going to become complicated. You're leaving a lot up to the judges. You want to, at the very least, make it very clear you weren't derivative, you had a case, this is what it was, they know what it is, it's right in front of their minds, and the attacks didn't work on it. At that point, then, we move on to rebuttal. The second of the skills. I think I'm not going to go into too much detail about how to do rebuttal in this, if only for the other reason that other people have done it very well elsewhere. I have extensive lectures on how to do rebuttal elsewhere as well, and if you're interested in that, I can find them somewhere. I think just on the cursory level of applying it specifically to whip speeches, as I said before, you're at the end of the debate now. You should be able to give the best version of a rebuttal than you can, and that's to attack it on every level of the argument that it can be attacked on. So you say the premise of the argument is wrong. Like, fundamentally, was this idea flawed? Will it happen? You attack the mechanistic layers of analysis. Did they prove what they said they were going to prove? Thirdly, you attack the impact or the value statement of it. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And fourthly, you can attack the importance with weighing. You can say whether or not this line of rebuttal is true, it doesn't affect the more important cases in the point. So we can outweigh that piece of rebuttal. We will accept, for example, that they have rebutted us and said, we won't convince the most extreme people, but our response to that is, we don't care, because the people we were trying to affect, if you looked at the extension, was this, or vice versa. In their argument, maybe they proved the most extreme people won't change. You're saying, we don't care, the people we want to change are in the middle, or something like that. That's the kind of scenario where that kind of thing plays out. And ideally, you attack it on every level that it has flaws within it. And there's two stages to that. The first is think through like these 4 ways to attack an argument. But secondly, also think through every layer of an argument and its analysis. So really important, I think, in the whip speech, if you intend to do rebuttal, that you actually get the structure of their argument. And I think a lot of people will write down the headline of their case and will listen to the analysis, but they won't write it down. They won't say what the individual points were. And so when they come to rebut it, they actually only deal with it on a very surface level. They don't deal with all the sub-points properly. And good rebuttal from the whip is going to attack every layer of that case, and it's going to attack it in multiple ways. And if you do that, you're likely to very significantly mitigate the best points of the other side to the point that your case is going to be much more persuasive against them. And you can do this in multiple levels, as I say. You can develop even if cases. You can say, even if you don't buy that case, that piece of rebuttal, you can try this one. Even if they are true in their best case scenario, use this one. So you want to always make sure you've got something against everything to the extent that that is time valuable. And don't waste your time attacking useless arguments. Don't, for example, if you think something else is going to be more important, and this goes back to what we were saying at the top of the session, if you think something else is a more important thing to do, don't feel the need to respond to everything, because it's sometimes not going to be important. Like, prioritize what you're rebutting, deal with the most important things first. And ideally, you want to do rebuttal that deals with a lot of stuff, because a lot of arguments are going to share premises, because in a quite narrow debate, which a lot of times debates are, when you're saying, for example, is this group of people better to do something, or this group? I'm thinking, for example, should we have technocrats or politicians making decisions about criminal justice policy, which was one of the motions at Doxbridge last week. A lot of those arguments will be based on the same premise. Flag up when you've responded to one of them. This also deals with this argument. It also deals with this argument. We got this response on this argument from this other team, but it's wrong for this reason. Try and package it as much as possible. Try and bring things together as much as possible, because you're saving time. You're dealing with more things. Don't just argue it to a wash. I think a lot of the time people are just like, well, this wasn't true. And that argument is at best just making that argument not be there anymore. More likely, you are mitigating down the likelihood that that argument is true, and it's still there and still needs to be weighed against what you've done. If you're going to try and mitigate an argument, make sure you weigh off its likelihood afterwards. Say, look, it's much less likely now, so you should prioritize what we told you. If you're, but ideally try and go beyond that, try and say, well, look, actually, they were so wrong about this. Actually, we can co-opt it for our side. They said these people are more accountable than the people we're talking about. Actually, they're wrong, they're less accountable, and that's a reason why we should be winning on our side. So use the rebuttal to drag things over to your side. It's particularly important from the whip speech to do that, because you can be credited for it in the whip speech, so it is new material, which is improving your position in the debate, because you can be credited for the negative material. And so if you can swing things to your side, all the better. And then this next point is the thing I said before, make sure you're actually dealing with all of the subpoints, mechanisms, the justification for their principle, the chain of logic that they present. Don't just deal with the top level point, deal with the whole thing. And then don't just leave it once you've done it. As I say, explain the importance of your rebuttal. Why were you devoting time to doing this rebuttal? If you made it as a strategic choice, there's a reason. Tell the judges what the reason is so that they understand as well why it was so important. Usually it'll only take you 5 seconds to give that piece of analysis, and it can oftentimes be the reason you end up winning the debate, because if you show that rebutting an accountability point leads a cascading chain of things down that mean all of their other points become unimportant because they were all premised on accountability, great, you've done it. Tell them that you've done it. Framing and characterization, I think, is at times important, at times not in the whip speech. I think it's often going to be the case you don't need to do this for the very simple reason is you will tell your partner to do this and your partner will do the very clever characterization as well. But there may be times where characterizations are coming out in lots of different ways between teams, and it becomes an important point in the whip speech to clarify which characterization is correct. And there will oftentimes be debates that depend on this, that the way we view the world will determine what the outcome is, and the arguments themselves aren't too important. So in a whip speech, you would want to devote a lot of time here to dealing with framing and characterization. And what I mean by this specifically, and this is, I think, where the line often will be drawn in what is acceptable in this regard, is giving a value neutral statement of what the world looks like. And you shouldn't be giving new positive analysis here, but using reference to existing positive analysis and explaining why it is true or should be weighed heavily is a valuable thing to do. I think there's a 4-step process to finding these characterizations and making them persuasive. 1, do you know what's true? If you do, explain why it's true. 2, are there other cases you know about, if you don't know that it's true, that you can say, well, this, I think, is true in other cases, so may be applicable here, and we can use that intuitively to explain why it will be true in this case. The third is there a general trade-off of characterization you can say, like, often there'll be things like, this message will be heard by more people, but will be less persuasive or less accurate, and vice versa. Is one of these general trade-offs in effect? Will that help you sort of form a characterization of what the world looks like in your mind, or at least a characterization that is believable by the judges? And then the fourth is just using common sense to try and intuit what might happen. What will it look like? How will people respond to the way that it looks like? Things like that, to just try and really piece it together in your head if you have absolutely no idea what it is. But the important thing here is the way that this links to what I think is the next slide, which is weighing, which is when you have characterizations and different teams disagree on what is likely to occur, and it's often like, how will people respond to this? And government is saying one thing and opposition saying another. Be clear. How many cases will they respond your way? How many cases will they respond the other way? And I think that level that up to the characterizations, like how often is each of these worlds likely to occur? How likely are they to occur? What's the risk of that? And weigh those characterizations in the debate. That's what you ideally should be doing from the whip, is using these characterizations to increase the value of arguments or pinpoint the value of arguments so that they can be compared to the other side. And it's, in fact, the next one is in fact not weighing. It's finding the comparative. We'll get to weighing in a minute. Hold that one in your head for when we get to weighing. Comparative analysis, I think, is really important. It's particularly important from the whip speech because you are at the end of the debate saying, here is option A, here is option B. We think you should pick the option our side is behind. So having a very clear comparative that runs through the whip speech is a fundamental skill to have, and taking time to set out that comparative is going to be a useful use of time in a lot of cases. So don't just analyze one side in a vacuum when you're doing this. And if you see there's an example down there, universities should establish dangerous spaces, which are spaces where people can say very controversial opinions, which have very little respect for people's views. I think it was the final of the Imperial Open, possibly this year. The idea is, don't just say it would be good if universities did this because it does these good things. What you should be comparing is, what does the world look like on either side? If they aren't doing this, what else are they doing instead? If they do this, does it mean other people do things? If those other people aren't responding to this, are they responding to something else? What does the whole world look like on either side? And I think often that won't be very different, because often the motion will be doing something quite specific and quite narrow. And all you need to do is say, what are the things that come from this motion specifically? How is the world different? And so once you know what that is like, you need to determine what the relative benefits and flaws of each side are, and use comparative language when you're doing this. Don't just be like, and I'll use the example here, we're going to see this in the next slide, but say you have a red pen and a pencil, don't just be like, the pen is red, because that's not comparative analysis. The pen is red, the pencil is gray, I suppose. The pen is more red than the pencil. It is more bold than the pencil is. It's also more permanent than the pencil is. That's a comparative, because you're giving analysis of what is more than the other thing. Contained within that is, this is going to be better at giving you red if you want red. That's what the comparative is going to do for you. It sets the terms of engagement for the debate, which then you can explain why you support. So that very simply looks like, the pen is redder than the pencil, should be intuitive. At this point, we think red is something we would like to have more than we would care about having a pencil that is erasable. That's the idea behind comparative analysis. And if you want another sort of intuitive example of what that looks like, look at the way that a lot of high-level judges will provide oral adjudications or reasons for discussion and for decisions. And that will often look like, they'll say, opening government gave us these arguments. Opening opposition gave us these arguments. And how do they interact with one another? How do they compare to one another? That's the same process for comparative analysis, I think, in 90% of cases. And we'll go on to now the pen and the pencil. This is the first game, and you'll find in the Discord server, the Simple Choices game. It's a PDF. It goes through like a lot of detail on this. The general idea of this exercise is you find two objects or two choices to compare, and it could be like, will I have pizza or like a healthy meal this evening for dinner? It could be anything like that. You take two things that can be compared, work out what are the relative assets and flaws like we've just done. And if you look through that document, you can see a fully fleshed out example of the pen and the pencil. Work out if there's any necessary context. For example, are we about to write an essay? We probably don't want the red pen if we're about to write an essay. Simple. And then you weigh between those relative assets and flaws and decide on the basis of that which of the two you would choose. And if you look in the document, you'll also see there are lots of examples with books which we would rather read from start to finish. I think it's quite an intuitive way to get an understanding of how you make these trade-offs in normal life and how you can apply that logic to debates. I won't dwell on this too much, but that's something you can go and have a look at in your own time. It'll help you develop these comparative analysis skills, which are fundamental to giving a whip speech, which is effectively showing the trade-offs between two sides. And I think even if you don't think this is particularly important in the context of the whip speech you're doing, you'll always want to have a little bit of this, even if it's right at the end, just saying to the judges in a single line, here's what the trade-off was, here's why you should care about our side more. So now we're on to weighing. There's not much to be said about this, really. Weighing is the skill of saying which is more important, this thing or this thing, and why. Here are just a number of reasons why you might say something is more important, because I couldn't really think of a general way to describe this. You can say, this argument is more important because it applies to all cases or applies to more cases than other arguments. And a typical example of this is saying there is one less assumption to our argument than everybody else's. And this could be like in a motion, which is this house believes that an organization should seek to do some kind of thing. And a lot of teams in those debates will say, here's why it would be good if the organization did that thing. And if you're saying, well, even seeking to do it would be good, you're making one less assumption, which means it automatically applies more often than their case does. You can say it applies to the most important people we should care about, and there must indeed then be a reason why you should care about them more. Typically, this is they are very, very vulnerable, and we should care about very, very vulnerable people for the important reason that if we don't, they will suffer more extreme harms than other people would. If people are likely to suffer some relatively minor harm, we should care more about this group of people. I think more often it is persuasive if it is we have a specific obligation to these people because, for example, we are ASEAN and they are ASEAN member states. Probably we care more about them than we do about the US's economic structures, that kind of thing. It applies to the most directly, specifically, or heavily affected people. I think this is sort of intuitively flows from the example above, but is slightly more specific. This is the highest impact argument. We could say, for example, if we think there is a reasonable chance this policy will lead to, everybody on the planet being nuked, we should care a lot about that. Even if it's not as certain as other arguments, we should be very, very worried about that impact. And so we should care about this more than other arguments in the debate. Bad example. Don't ever argue that a policy will lead to everybody on the planet being nuked. It probably won't. It's the flip side of this is obviously certainty. We are certain this will happen. So even if the other side had very high impact arguments, we should care a lot about the fact this is definitely going to happen. Probably if they're talking about changes in the macroeconomic structures of the world, probably there are lots of other factors that will affect that. It's not certain this will have a decisive effect on changing things in a big way. We told you people are going to be very upset by this. It's almost definitely going to happen. That's not to say it has lower impact. Probably it has quite high impact if people's lives are meaningfully affected in a big way, but certainty can be used then to weigh that idea and say, you should care about it a lot more than uncertain things. The next one is a little bit more complicated. It is, can we get our goals universally? So for example, if we're saying we have an obligation to provide security for the people who live within our country, but we can only get that benefit for a handful of people by this, and people will still have their security stripped from them, but we perhaps have a different principled obligation to justice in the debate. We maybe care more about the justice principle in this case, because we can definitely give the principle of justice to everybody who needs it, but we can't give the principle of security to everyone who needs it, because many people will still have their security lost because of factors which aren't in play in the debate. So that's just a very technical weighing mechanism, often between principles, is the universality of your execution. The next is necessity. Can we give something which is necessary in order to achieve something which is very important? Can we deal with something which is urgent, like lots of people are dying now? Should we prioritize that over the long term because it really matters right now that we have a solution to this problem? And then the last one is short term versus long term, which is more important. It's going to depend on the debate, and you can probably make the argument either way, but that's just another way you can weigh up between them. Fundamental to all of these is you need to say why it's the correct way to weigh the debate, because just stating it isn't going to be persuasive to the judges, because it just gives them an idea. And if someone else has a different idea about how it should be weighed, as indeed they should, they have no way to decide between them which is correct. It's really easy to just say, we should care more about certainty because we can assure that we get this benefit, and they can't. And that single piece of analysis makes this weighing metric already the most persuasive one in the debate, and suddenly they need to respond to it if they don't want it to be the most persuasive thing in the debate. Lots of people don't do it. It's an easy way to get wins from the whip speech, particularly since you've got a case that opening government can't properly weigh against. If you're a closing government, you can say why yours was better than theirs, and they have a 15-second POI to closing opposition to try and explain why you're wrong while dealing with loads of other stuff. They probably won't do it. If you give a good justification for why your way up is correct, you have a very good chance of beating your opening half. And that just iterate that a level beyond, weigh arguments, but also weigh like team contributions as a whole. Like they gave us these things, but we have like this one thing that's particularly important. It outweighs all of the arguments, or it outweighs this one in this way, this one in this way, etc., etc. Clarification, I'll do very quickly, because hopefully you shouldn't have to do it too often. You might want to do it in a couple of cases. One is your case was very complicated and the judges don't know what you're talking about. You should never be in this position because it means that something has already gone wrong. Ideally, you would just be clear in the extension and this wouldn't be a problem. Sometimes it happens. You might want to do some clarification if this is the case. The second is more likely the other side have mischaracterized what you said and have pretended it's something else. And for some reason, you are worried that the judges will agree with this weird mischaracterization rather than what you actually said. The third one is if you want to try to cheat because you don't think you're winning and you want to pretend the extension was something that sounds similar but wasn't. Please don't do this because judges, again, should be able to pick up on it, but you might want to do it in that case. And I won't judge you if you do. And the fourth is if you want to just be really, really clear, and we talked about this before, that there is a value to being very, very clear about what your contribution was, particularly if there is an enormous amount of material in the debate. You want to be very tight and clear that this is the thing you brought. Probably you want to devote just a couple of lines to this kind of clarification most of the time, but probably you don't want to go much beyond it. In terms of how to clarify, it's exactly the same as the rebuild principle. One, you flag up what part of the extension you're talking about that you don't think was clear. Secondly, you address any kind of mischaracterization by the other side, how they referred to it, why it's wrong. Clarify how it should be viewed in the debate, how it should be weighed in the debate, and you can use characterization and framing and things like that to do that, and then restate what the chain of logic is, what they should believe the case is. If you're just doing it for the reason that you want to be clear about your case, you shouldn't need to do much of the first 3 steps, because that shouldn't really be a problem that you're trying to deal with. But if there is, that's how you do it. Refer back to the rebuild slide. Don't concede it was too complicated. Don't pretend you're shifting the burden, because you shouldn't be. Just be very, very clear that you want to clarify what you actually said in the extension and why it should be viewed that way, not the way the other side said it. Second game, again, you'll see a handout. Another exercise to practice a wider set of whip speech skills all in one go. This one, you take a motion, pick a side for that motion, you get 5 general arguments for one of those sides. So I believe the first example in the handout is this house would legalize all drugs, and the 5 arguments are for proposition. And there's a list of 5 arguments a proposition team might be able to run in that case. You'll notice it's not a full argument, it's just the idea of an argument which the game assumes you will take at its best. You pick 3 of the 5 arguments, you say why they're wrong. And that's practicing the rebuttal skill, obviously, because it's rebuttal. As if you were, for example, CG, and these were arguments made by opening opposition and closing opposition. And then from the remaining 2 arguments, you pick one of them. You're almost, in this case, taking it as your extension and saying, this was what we said. Why was it more important than the second argument, the one that remains after the other 3 have been removed? And in this case, you're using the weighing skill, practicing that. Just a really, really simple game to practice those sets of skills, because then you can take your answer, you can compare it to what other people did, and you can say, well, why did you think those were the 3 vulnerable arguments you wanted to do rebuttal to? And why did you think this was the one most important argument you wanted to weigh in the debate? People will have different answers. It allows you to compare weighing metrics, compare rebuttal, make all of them more powerful, because by comparison to others, it's how we learn and how we get better at the game. There are 3 examples, I think, in the handout in sort of like progressing degrees of sort of detail in debates, but not really. It's very easy to do your own ones of these. Just watch a video on YouTube, make a list of 5 arguments that came up from the government bench, and you can do the game. You can also probably just make them up your own, because it's pretty easy to come up with 5 very simple arguments for a particular side of a debate. And that's just another way that you can improve those skills if you're worried about that. So as we move on from skills to structures, the other thing you're going to need to do then is work out what's the best way to do a whip speech. We've got all of these skills. How do we fit them into a mesh that will make sense? And in a moment, we'll look at some different ways to do that in a very sort of cursory way, because we don't have too much time today. But what's the general principle you should employ when you're thinking about which to do? 1, think about what you need to contribute from the whip speech in order to win the round. And so you can imagine at the end, the scenario where you've won the round, where you are now, and everything that needs to happen between those 2 things in order for you to get that win. So what do you need to prioritize from those 6 things we talked about before? Is it rebutting a particularly powerful argument? Is it rebuilding your case because it suffered lots of attacks? Is it weighing between things because there are equally good cases and you need to be very clear why yours was most important? Just think about which of these is going to be most important. Also think, not just in those terms, but in terms of which teams you want to prioritize. Did opening government do a really good job? If so, you might want to talk about them quite a bit so that you compare what you did to what they did. If one of the opposition teams did a particularly good thing and also poses a big threat to you, you might want to focus on them. Don't focus too much on explaining why a team that has obviously lost has lost. Obviously, there are times where you will think a team has obviously lost and they won't have done. Try to avoid those scenarios, but and deal with all teams to an extent. But if you're 100% certain a team is out of the debate, you don't need to spend a lot of time explaining why that's true and why you beat them, unless you are also very close to being out of the debate. Use the time effectively is what I'm saying. The other consideration you might want to have is, was this a messy debate that had lots of different arguments? Was it very technical on one very focused issue? Was it about how a particular principle weighed? Was it about a mechanism that is particularly important? Think about these kinds of things, because they will also shape how you want to summarize the debate from the whip speech. And the goal should always be, as we said at the start of the session, what's the structure I can use that's going to make it really clear that our team won regardless of what else happened in the round? And that's always what you should be trying to do. But as we said before, there are time limitations. You're dealing with limited time, so it's going to be quite difficult. If you go in with some degree of a default option for what you will do in the debate, if you like go into the round itself, with some kind of idea of what the default option is going to be, if you don't have time to think about how to perfectly structure it on the fly. And if you think about that during prep time, and if you get generally better at this skill of making these strategic choices, you'll be in a stronger position. Because the last thing you want is to get called up to give your speech and have a whole bunch of stuff and no idea how you're going to deliver that material. Because almost without exception, you will miss out important things that you should have done. Because you'll have really good rebuttal, but you won't remember that it's something you need to prioritize. And it depends really on how you're taking notes. We'll talk about that later. But if you're doing like on a computer, either because you're online or because you have like a laptop or an iPad with you, you can move things around in sort of the order of your speech. If you're doing it in person, you might want to have like different pieces of paper you can move around to sort out the structure as you go. But stay flexible. Don't stick to anything that you thought of as your default option. Go with what you think is going to work if you're able to. So here are 6 examples of a way you could structure your speech. As I say, don't be prescriptive, do what works for the debate. Here are 6 examples you might want to get used to, because they are, by and large, in my opinion, the 6 most common ways to summarize a debate. The first is having a chain of logic, which is, here is what my partner said in extension. We'll take you through all the claims that they made, and in doing so, deal with all the other ideas in the debate. And you might want to do this where you have, as a team, one very key logical claim. So it might be, for example, this economic model has led to this particular problem because of a series of steps in context. And you might want to walk through that chain of logic very specifically to make it clear to the judges that it's important, but also because a mechanism might deal with a particular part of the other side. The impact might be comparable to the other side. It might be more persuasive than something else. You might want to weigh things. And that looks like the way you structure is that just take the structure of the extension speech and use that structure to base the whip on. The second is varieties of cases. So, for example, stakeholders, countries, contexts, frameworks, sections of community. This is, for example, there are 5 moral frameworks in this debate. I'm going to talk to you about each one of them and why our team is winning under all of them. We're going to talk about businesses, individuals, and governments and how they respond to this new incentive. We're talking about, I don't know, African nations in this debate. Here's how it works for countries like Botswana. Here's how it works for countries like South Africa. Here's how it works for countries like Nigeria. That's not a very good one because you're probably not going to have that, but that kind of thing. Issues that came up in the debate, which are in lots of different categories. Useful if you're dealing with a debate which has lots of these different categories, and either you want to prove you win on all of them, or you can deal with the ones you don't win and you want to weigh between them. That's a useful way to deal with that kind of debate. The next is the sort of the rebuttal extension, the rebuttal whips, which is either it's just rebuttal or it's rebuttal, but at the start you say, here's what the extension was, by the way, and we're going to use it now to do all this rebuttal. Typically when you've got very strong teams that are going to have said a lot of stuff, it won't have been dealt with in the debate, and you want to be able to knock out all those claims while also taking credit for doing so. Typically, this is going to be one where you're going to be in the debate thinking, oh no, lots of stuff still standing, but the extension did a really good job and I don't need to focus on that too much. So I want to just focus on this rebuttal. You'll notice there's a star behind this one and the next one. It's because these are 2, which in theory, you can always do from the whip speech. And so if you did want to go into a debate, having one in mind that you were always going to do, you could do these 2. I strongly regard that you shouldn't. I think you really, really should focus on doing what works. The second is the classic sort of team-based one. Why does our team beat OG? Why does our team beat OO? Why does our team beat CO, etc.? That's assuming your CG works the other way for the other team way around. Particularly useful if teams have very different contributions, or you beat teams for different reasons, and so you want to deal with them in a granular way. I think if opening government talks about accountability and closing government talks about accountability, and you're the op whip, it makes no sense to respond to their claims on accountability and then theirs separately. You wouldn't want to use this in those cases. I appreciate a lot of people do this as a default these days. It's not always the best move because you often repeat yourself. But if teams have different contributions, this is a good way to go. Or if the other scenario where this applies is if you're in the middle of the debate and you want to lock down second place, being able to split teams up and say, we definitely beat that team who took the 4th, we definitely beat that team who took the 3rd, is a really effective way to use your time to deal with it. So it's another reason you might want to do this. The next one, which I noticed also has a star next to it, is points of clash, which is if the debate can be summarized by a bunch of themes, and they don't need to be sort of like very grand themes, they can be the theme of the mechanism of accountability that teams talked about. Use this one. Another popular one, generally you can use it. And then the last is the principle and practical. Separate out principle reasons from practical ones, deal with all the principles, say like these don't apply, this one does apply, it's what we brought you in extension, and then deal with all the practical stuff separate from that. Typically, it will be very clear in a debate if you want to do that, because there will be principles and practical arguments which are separate from one another. Normally, I say this one happens in debates about democracy, where you want to make a general point about efficacy and how effective this democratic system is, and also one about the legitimacy of the system and principally what we would want in a democracy. This is the most common place where that one lines up. But at a glance, those are 6 different ways you can do it. Try out different ones, see what works for you, see what's likely to work in different debates. If you get these in the back of your mind, you're going to be much better able to just pull one out just before you give your speech, throw everything into the right order, and give a killer whip speech. A little bit quickly on how to prepare, bearing in mind we're a little bit close to the end of time. Work out what the debate's going to come down to at the prep time, like before the debate begins, what's going to be particularly important to prove, what's going to be the key clash in the debate, what is ultimately the thing that by the whip speech we will want to have proven, so that we can have really strong framing in that on the whip for why we've won that. Work out what the extension's likely to be. This is less of an issue in online debating because you've got like some kind of chat message on Discord with your partner and you're probably talking constantly. It's more so an issue where you are sitting in a room with terrible acoustics, whispering into someone's ear, and people keep telling you to be quiet. You want to, although you're going to want to communicate in the debate, you're going to want to have a really strong idea of what the extension is likely to be in a lot of detail, because it's going to be much harder to communicate that in a very detailed way during the debate. And as I say, less of an issue in the online era of debating, but also still an issue. Like, know what the extension is going to be, know it in detail, know what it's trying to prove, know what its weaknesses are, because all of that is going to give you ammunition in the whip speech that you can deal with. If you can prepare some notes as well for important things which are likely to come up, like we'll go back to the technocrats versus politicians deciding criminal justice policy debate, because we'll see a clip from that in a minute. In that debate, you know really as opposition that government are going to say, here are a number of reasons why we are able to have better decisions from technocrats. So if you just have a list of reasons prepared for why they are not going to make better decisions, you can just grab that during the key point of your whip speech where you need to deal with that argument and be like, boom, it's prepared. I don't need to write it in the debate. I've saved a lot of time by having this thing I know will be relevant ready to hand. During the debate, pay attention to how arguments are being received, both objectively, think how does this interact with other issues in the debate, but also do the judges look like they're buying it, and how does it fit into what we're trying to do in the round. Keep track of how arguments are being responded to, not just the other side so that you can respond to them, but also your top half, your partner, so you know what level of detail has been responded at. And the detail element is crucial here. So many times you'll see teams thinking an argument has been dealt with because someone gave a cursory piece of rebuttal to it. You can always say opening government responded to this specific piece of analysis in the point on accountability. We have a better response that deals with the whole point. We also deal with the second subpoint, which they didn't deal with. And so our response was much more compelling than the one that they gave you. Having that level of detail will always improve your whip speech. And then also communicate with your partner. Don't waste their time. Don't give the extension speaker loads of information they aren't going to need. Don't give them 10 pieces of rebuttal you know that they're not going to have time to say, because they really need to be focusing on something else, and you need to be thinking about a different set of things than what they are. Only give them the information that they need, and there's a line to be drawn there that will require a value judgment. And then obviously the last thing is you need to know what the extension is, so you need to ask them. Ideally, at the end of the deputy or some way through the deputy speech of your bench, say, great, we've heard what top half ran, what are we running in extension? Probably it's the thing you talked about before in prep time, and if it is, that's great. If it's not, now you know where the debate is going. Don't miss that step because it's an important one. Burdens. And this is where we try and do something really technically cool as we look at a horrible picture of me. Set strategic burdens for your team. Very simply, just say, here's what the world looks like if the government side wins. Here's what it looks like if the opposition side wins. Here are the things you would need to believe, not what the world looks like. Here's the things you'd need to believe. And just do it in a way that is fair and intuitive. Probably there will be a fair way to do it on either motion. And your case, ideally, should align very perfectly with that burden if you've done a decent job of this. Ultimately, though, there's a reason why your team picked the extension that it did. And probably it is that it hits this burden for why you would be winning the debate. And obviously, if it doesn't, then like pick a burden where you are winning because you want to win, and show why your side is the team that meets the burden. So there's an example here from the debate we've talked about a lot, the technocrats or politicians deciding on criminal justice policy. I'm going to try to play a 40-second clip here. I'm going to hope you can hear it. If not, I'll just repeat what I say. Oh, God, no, I've gone the wrong way. Previous.
I think you have to also share the voice.
Yeah, don't worry. It's fine. I'll say what I'm saying in this clip. Basically, it's the technocrats or politicians deciding on criminal justice policy. The argument in this, in 40 seconds, is look, either way, we have both of them. There are politicians who exist either way. There are still advisors who can advise the politicians. The question is, who has the final decision? And in the context where there's a very small difference, would we rather have politicians make the final decision, where they can choose between different sets of evidence that might disagree, or would we rather have technocrats make the final decision, where they're choosing between political decisions that lots of people have different opinions on? That is, I think, a fair and neutral burden that either team could argue for, but it is immediately preceded by 7 minutes on why it is very important that we retain the final decisions of individuals because preferences matter, but also some material on why there is no perfect decision and therefore technocrats are trying to get to something which doesn't exist. So it is a burden that seems fair, but which directly aligns with what you've given in the whip speech as the thesis for why your team would be winning. That's the gold standard of what you're trying to get to. We won this round. I stand by it. I think it was a good one. You can see the video online if you want to disagree with me. But basically, the idea of burdens is that you are setting the framework for what it looks like if government wins, what it looks like if opposition wins, and trying to make it very obvious that the thing you've done has just met that burden for your side. POIs. A couple of strategic things here. I won't go into too much detail on this. Read it on the PowerPoint later. Give clever POIs. Don't give away too much, but at least give them some idea that they can engage with, because if they engage with your case in a POI, then great, you've heard what their response is going to be and you can respond to that response. Listen to other teams' POIs because they might give away what they're going to argue about and you can prepare for things. That's pretty basic stuff. Play for second. If you're in an out round or if you just want to take the second in a round because the team's very good, here are 3 quick rationales you can always use. If you want to win with your top half, you say, look, our side of the debate won decisively. If you want to say bottom half went through, you'll be like top half missed the debate as a whole. They talked about stuff that was irrelevant. If you want to say, well, your diagonal went through, you're like, there was a really good case from opening on the other side, but our top half didn't deal with it. It's the most important case from the other side. Only we deal with it. So it's more important than the bottom half. It's more important than our top half. And you go through its diagonal. Those are the 3 ways you can do it. Also, if you combine them, you'll notice that that becomes a way for why you are winning the debate, because you're beating your top half, you're beating the other team on the bottom half, and you're also beating the team on the diagonal. Easy peasy. Notes. Do what works for you in a sentence. There are a handful of things you're going to want to be writing down. Write down the arguments raised by other teams, but also the subpoints within them in as much detail as you possibly can, because you're going to need to know what that structure of the argument was so that you can pull it apart. Have exactly what your partner said in the extension, and ideally is the sort of the little bullet point of here's what we gave you in the case in 30 seconds that covers exactly why we're going to win. Have an idea of what your structure is going to be, particularly if you're doing it a thematic way. Have like a sense of what those themes are and how arguments fit into each of them. Maybe use a different pen color. That often is a popular one. Know what you're going to say, obviously. And if you are doing points of clash, like here are what the points of clash might be. So you can sort notes by theme. You'll notice at this point there are 2 additional handouts, which are examples. And I think I should have them here. Yeah, here are 2 examples of ways of things that work for me. Don't just copy what I do, because I do terrible, horrible things with my note taking that people shouldn't replicate. But on the left here, you'll see, and I can annotate, like on the left here, you can see an example of handwritten notes. I appreciate that's not handwritten notes. It is a direct transcription. And the idea of this is that on the left-hand side here is stuff you do in prep time. Like these are the ideas we might have for our extension. Here are the things that each of the speakers before you on your side said. The middle bit is the rebuttal, which is their arguments in specific structure and then our responses to each of them. And then on the right-hand side, you can see there's a speech structure. And the left and right-hand sides here are meant to be different pieces of paper. So on the right-hand side, you'd be like, here's what I want to do. I want to start with some framing, and that's going to cover a general point about a point of clarification. 11 and 13 on here. I don't know what 13. Oh, no, 11 and 3 here. You can see they're colored to match. And then we're going to go into our points of clash. The first is resource use, and that's going to deal with 1, finite resources, 2, wealth and jobs, 10, and you can see sort of like it fits into that structure. Basically the same idea with the online notes, but because they're online and maybe you're typing to a Word document, you can literally just move stuff around. And so you don't need to do this rebuttal 11, rebuttal 3 thing. You can just literally move things into a big block. And so you can see I've done that. In this example, you can read all of my notes from the debate that I just indicated there's a 40-second clip of. And you can literally look at those because they are now on the Discord. You can look through all my notes from those rounds. You'll notice when I do, I have an unfortunate habit of writing things exactly as I intend to say them. Don't do that, like, unless you think you can pull it off, like take notes and just speak from the notes. Why am I not moving on? Summary, the things that I said. I'm not going to read the summary. It's a summary of the things I've already said. We've got a few minutes, I think. Ideally for questions, because I think different people have very different experiences of this. So are there any questions? I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Can I stop the recording?
I can't. Hopefully someone can.
Can I do this? Do I have the permission?